part 4 of my interview with David Bentley Hart, we talk about what he has described as a strange nostalgia for a pagan past, where some critics seem to think that the pagan world was a whole lot better than the Christian society that eventually overtook it.
No, look, I'm a classicist in part by training, and I love the classical world. I love classical literature. But this picture of pagan antiquity is frankly absurd. For one thing, it goes back to Gibbon, of course, to claim that polytheism is by nature more tolerant than Christianity. It was more welcoming. Now, anyone who's really familiar with the time, you know that this is a rather silly notion. It was more tolerant of, a cult of a particular god and goddess might be perfectly tolerant of another cult, as long as they both belong to the same continuum of worship, as long as they fit within the sort of Indo-European pagan. And even then, there are all sorts of not only disagreements but actual violence. If you want a good example of interreligious, if nothing else, disdain, you don't have to have an example of violence. Read Apuleius's Golden Ass and see how Lucius feels about the worshippers of Atargatis as opposed to the worshippers of Isis. You know, it's all the difference in the world. But also, and there was real violence. Now, but also, it overlooks the formidable element of melancholy and sort of resigned suffering that's part of the aesthetic and the moral and the spiritual basis of both Attic culture and, in some ways, of late Roman culture, to which the best solution offered in antiquity was probably Stoicism. It's the most moral, it's the most serene, it's the most wisely resigned, to which the most philosophically ecstatic response, though, was Platonism. But to be honest, the one thing that's clear, and pagan critics of Christianity regarded this as one of the unseemly elements of the faith, is that Christianity was notable in part in the ancient world for its kind of brainless cheerfulness in the eyes of many. And that if we're really going to make these vast generalizations about cultural periods, there's far more cheer. There's far more cultural emphasis upon good community and fellowship in the High Middle Ages than you find anywhere in the remains of antiquity. And it's not. And one more thing about the religious pluralism, point I should make is that whereas religious cults could tolerate one another once they had become used to one another, what they couldn't tolerate and didn't tolerate, of course, were different visions of religion, different visions of piety, different visions of truth. Persecutions of aberrant sects, persecutions of Christians may have been sporadic, but they were part of the religious temper of the time. The Christians were considered atheists. They were atheists in the sense that this was understood. They fixed their minds entirely on a transcendent God, and therefore all the gods in between became otiose and in some sense malign. Seems a bit unfair, but times change. But Christopher Hitchens talks about that bright and vibrant culture that's sort of exterminated. Ultimately, as the result, the seed of its destruction lies in the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucids, as if the Seleucids are wonderful examples of religious tolerance. A.C. Grayling, someone I had hoped would be a good atheist, a cleverer one than his peers, but actually doesn't have any more cultural, historical subtlety apparently than others. In one of his essays talks about be a small loss. Maybe we lose all those ages of Christian art, but wouldn't we rather see more paintings of Venus rising from the Paphian foam than of
Right,
than
whereas
of
your
than of
argument
the Christ? Well,
is
my
that-
argument's twofold. Along with that, of course, is a society of such massive injustice and inequity and sort of pervasive cruelty that if it were looked into very closely by the people who make these absurd statements, they would be ashamed of themselves. The other is, of course, that A.C. Grayling remark is interesting to me because, yes, I admit that Venus rising from the sea is a lovelier image than Christ being taken down from the cross, if I'm affectively speaking of sensuous, erotic interest. But isn't it interesting, though, that somehow the broken body of this peasant becomes the center of a grave and tragic meditation that can illuminate a world of human concerns. That you don't find in antiquity.